Lawrence Schauers was 19 years old when a fatal accident changed his life forever. From being an athletic young man and bodybuilder, he was left wheelchair-bound with half of his body amputated. He survived by sheer miracle, and today he shows through social media how he copes with his existence under these conditions.
So I was 2.5 hours away from our hometown, traveling every week for work. Since my supervisor really liked me, he asked me to do pretty much everything he wanted. So my boss asked me to drive the forklift, cross it and put the water barrier back in its position. I was never even trained to drive a forklift.
The lack of experience, training, and supervision is what ultimately led to this heartbreaking outcome. Loren fell from a height of about 15 meters, which is equivalent to a 4th floor. Then his body received the impact of the forklift from which he had been ejected seconds before. The most chilling part is that during all that painful span of time, the young man remained absolutely conscious, watching as parts of his body were scattered around him and feeling without anesthesia all the torture. His story has become an example of personal overcoming because despite the adversities, this survivor has been able to overcome all the obstacles that have been presented to him with the support of his family, his girlfriend, and of course endless therapies for a more optimal recovery. Before the tragedy, the young Loren led a life as common as any boy his age. He resided in the mountains in the United States with his family, who maintained a strong bond of unity and support among themselves. However, not everything was rosy at home because despite having a roof to live under and a plate of food on the table, the economic situation was not exactly ideal. All the members knew both hard work and the effort to survive. And although it was not easy to get the cash to pay the rent, food, and footwear, at home, there was always the harmonious atmosphere of solidarity, love, and the warmth of the family. From a very early age, Loren enjoyed being an active young man. He had many friends in the neighborhood where he lived. He used to run through the streets, ride a bike, undoubtedly enjoying a happy childhood full of good memories that, without knowing in the future, he would treasure in the most nostalgic way possible. At a very early age, he became aware of the difficult situation at home, so he decided to leave behind that life of games and fun to start bringing in money, hoping to support his loved ones in some way. His first job opportunities came in the labor field. There they gradually gained enough experience to carry out increasingly complicated activities. Meanwhile, Loren didn't want to neglect her passion for physical exercise. Despite having long working hours as a laborer, he always found time to keep up with his daily routine, becoming so disciplined that he was close to fitting the profile for bodybuilding, which gave him a promising future in this field. But for now, he had to focus on earning enough money to fulfill his dreams. Amidst all this effort then, the young man had the joy of sharing his life with his girlfriend, who was a girl whose sincere love served as the main engine to move forward.
We met at work and ended up getting together at a mutual friend's house. It just happened. We were together for 1.5 years or a little more when the accident happened, and we've been living together for a year. So we were pretty solid in our relationship when the accident happened.
The affection of Xavier Wright drove him to improve in his tasks. Now that they lived together, he was the main support of the household. In construction, one of his greatest attributes was carrying heavy objects. Thanks to his good physical condition, the supervisors entrusted him with tasks of great effort, which for Loren was not a big problem. However, having so little experience in handling heavy machinery, it was not a good idea to leave him tasks in which he had to manipulate such equipment, for example, a forklift. So, shortly before the accident, in the year 2019, the young man was part of a work team that had the task of building a car bridge. He went every day to the outskirts of the city after a long journey and did his duties as he should. He used personal protective equipment, followed safety protocols, and tried to move to all points of the construction with enough care. Loren had a team that used to compete in monthly tournaments for the sole purpose of having fun and hanging out for a while. He was also a faithful follower of the Montana Grizzlies American football team, which added another hobby in his life because he went to the games with his friends to support the players. In all aspects of his life, Loren was an absolutely normal young man, you realize. Hardworking, loving, provider, fun, but above all, very active. Basically, his life was governed by the high physical activity he developed in the gym, in sports, and even at work. Unfortunately, in his work environment, he was suddenly told that he would have to operate heavy machinery, in this case, a forklift. Being such a responsible worker, he had no objection. Perhaps he made it easy, or thought that his brief notions to the activity would serve him to be able to carry out the tasks without problem. As you realize, or as you can already imagine, he was totally wrong. The truth is that as an employee, he never received the ideal training to start operating these types of machines.
So I unbuckled my seatbelt. I went to jump even though I was never trained to operate a forklift.
I wasn't even qualified to be on the forklift.
Yes, so I didn't know the protocol.
What protocol was it?
That I was supposed to stay in the forklift while it's moving.
Just before September 27th, the day of the accident, Loren was living the last days of her life as they knew it. For her part, she was following the routine as she had been doing so far. However, her girlfriend knew. She had a kind of bad feeling. You know, women have that sixth sense. Lately, very catastrophic ideas were coming to her mind. That if you look for a reason, it possibly started when she found out her partner was using a forklift without being fully trained. However, the only thing within her reach was to stay positive and ask her boyfriend to please take great care of himself, because even though the fear was there, none of them could have anticipated the tragedy that was already looming over their lives. And that morning, the guys said goodbye as usual to carry out their daily routine. Sabia continued with those catastrophic thoughts in her mind, and in fact, it seems that that day they intensified to the point that at a certain moment she wanted to call her partner on the phone, but he could not answer because during working hours he used to leave his cell phone aside. She didn't find the lack of communication strange. In fact, it was a sign that Loren was still maintaining this cautious way of handling herself at the construction site, especially now that she had the responsibility of operating heavy machinery. Even so, the girl remained worried almost all day until, unfortunately, her greatest fear materialized.
We received the first call around 5 in the afternoon, and then it went from, minor damage. She was in intensive surgery, they were fixing some bleeding in the pelvis and this and that. And then around 4 in the morning, we received the call that they had amputated both her legs and her right arm, her kidneys were failing and she was in critical condition, and we needed to get there as soon as possible because they didn't even know if she would survive the night.
The news hit him like a bucket of cold water. His worst nightmare had come true, and he didn't know if he would ever see the boy he loved most alive again. Meanwhile, at the scene of the incident, which was almost empty, one could guess the heartbreaking moment lived hours before, as the building had completely collapsed. The Monte Carlos had fallen from far away and landed on the driver's legs. The truth was that in his condition, he basically needed a miracle to survive. And if he did, his existence would take a 360-degree turn without legs. Neither of his arms would naturally be drastically affected. Perhaps emotional problems, difficulties in adapting. I remind you that he was an extremely active boy. Unfortunately, Loren was a victim of some negligence on the part of the company, her supervisor, and some indiscretions by the drivers who crossed the avenue where the construction work was taking place. It was as if the universe, let's say, had aligned in such a way that she ended up with her legs under the gigantic iron machine so heavy it could make her explode in seconds.
We had just opened the lane on the bridge. We had to change lanes because we were behind schedule and the lane we opened was not yet finished. It was like, bridge, then asphalt. Well, It was dirt because dirt goes under the asphalt, bridge, then dirt again. So we lifted the water barriers, filled them with water already. You know, the orange water barriers that go at the end, and then a car came and knocked down a water barrier.
The carelessness of that car that knocked down the water barrier was what started the series of events that would lead Loren to the worst accident of his life. Well, in response, the construction supervisor asked the young man to go up the forklift to solve the problem caused by the car driver minutes ago. Unfortunately, that civilian would not be the only one to cross the bridge without caution. Just as Lawrence was performing the necessary maneuvers, another car sped past, disregarding that it was a work area and ignoring the traffic lights. The young operator could see the car approaching with no intention of slowing down, so he did what he could to get himself out of the way, when in reality it is the drivers passing through the construction zone who should be driving with caution. Then things became quite critical in a matter of seconds, given that the efforts to dodge that car turned out to be quite useless. Before he could get out of the way, the forklift that was on a ground full of slippery and unstable dirt received a blow strong enough to unbalance it.
Well, the car pushed me so far to one side that the slope to my right and the loose dirt began to make the forklift rise. Well, I tried to tilt the forklift down and it wouldn't tilt. It was slowly creaking to tip over. So I unbuckled my seatbelt to jump out, given that I had never trained for this. For a forklift situation.
That's how his lack of experience, the carelessness of motorists, the negligence of his supervisor, and poor ground conditions culminated in the worst possible outcome. Loren starred in a disturbing scene as if it were taken from a fiction movie. Just before the forklift headed towards the abyss, the driver tried to disassociate himself from it as soon as possible. He chose to unbuckle his seatbelt and jump to wherever he could be safe. However, once again, fate played against him, causing the same belt to get tangled in his leg, so he was thrown 15 meters down along with the monstrous machine, first hitting the pavement, then receiving the weight of the machinery on his legs. His body literally exploded in a matter of seconds from the waist down and his right forearm. Following the accident, Loren remembers that somehow he was able to remain conscious the entire time, perplexed at the ephemeral way in which half of him disappeared. Neither he nor the doctors could believe his survival. Parts of his limbs were scattered around. However, both his torso and his head remained in place, although quite injured. On the other hand, after the incredible shock, his co-workers called for emergency services. Given that little could be an ambulance considering the critical state of the patient, a helicopter arrived instead. They needed to quickly transport him to a hospital, so they lifted Loren's body with part of his legs hanging. It could be said that he even had no life expectancy to reach the medical center. But going against all odds, the young man still showed vital signs. What we can say was a true miracle. Once in the hands of professionals, they noticed that miraculously, as I tell you, his cognitive part was intact. However, they had a quite complex medical challenge in front of them. They even confessed to the family that they had no idea how they could save him. Being an extremely complicated case, already being in the Seattle hospital, they opted to call an experienced surgeon who, in fact, had already retired. He had the opportunity to review the situation and noticed that Lorenz's body tissue was still dying, despite the initial amputations. The doctors were already running out of options to save the patient's life, and they had a meeting every day with the family to inform them of the details of the situation.
And then, the next day, they took us to another family meeting and they talked about a hemicorporectomy surgery that was essentially the only way to save his life, but it also meant that everything below his belly button would be amputated.
The task he had ahead was extremely complicated, but essential if they wanted to save Loren's life. Surprisingly, the boy was able to overcome all the obstacles that presented themselves as medical complications. For example, a pulmonary embolism and having to be connected to a breathing tube due to having suffered arterial blockages. Thus, throughout this process, there were also doubts and uncertainty obviously about whether he was going to make it, to survive or not. Which is why Miss Wright had to bear the idea of having to say goodbye, as she didn't want to leave anything unsaid to her boyfriend. And even though it was hard, there were 6 occasions when the boy's life was literally hanging by a thread, so they said goodbye 6 times. Perhaps they themselves have not been able to grasp indeed until now how he is still alive. But the doctors made it possible by amputating half of his body. However, Loren's desire to move forward had a lot to do with it. Seeing his girlfriend completely desperate for a miracle, that helped him cling to life more than ever. Regardless of the consequences of living in a new reality, this survivor wanted to see the good that would come from being able to return home, gradually resuming his life as normally as his condition would allow, and he could only achieve this obviously with the help of his loved ones. Since then, as a couple, they began to document the entire process of his recovery, not knowing that this material would later provide great financial support, considering the fact that the young man could no longer work. Each passing day, the hopes of returning home grew considerably and amazingly. The couple remained in good spirits almost all the time.
Accepting their new reality.
Without prejudice or
Regret.
Accepting his new reality without prejudice or regret, Loren began to genuinely smile, largely doing so thanks to his girlfriend, who was with him from the beginning, and throughout all 3 months he remained recovering in the hospital. For her part, Sabia not only had to face the accident from the caregiver's side, but she also became the target of criticism for her decision to stay instead of starting a new life, far from the responsibility that comes with being available 24 hours a day for her partner, who unfortunately could no longer fend for himself. And it's here where this girl shows the meaning of true love. To stay in good times and bad, because in her plans, there was never for a second the idea of running away. On the contrary, the relationship solidified even more to the point that once the recovery crisis was overcome, they decided to get married. Thus, they celebrated the wedding in February 2021. Both were a little more calm and without the uncertainty of the future, since Loren had almost completely recovered by that time. They became an irrefutable proof of what a loving bond truly is, being there for each other in the worst moments and being able to overcome all the difficulties that life put them through. That ceremony was like the new beginning to their new life. And regarding the economy, if you were wondering, of those now exposed, they received a good compensation, with which they were able to forge a future, obtaining the new house in which they now live and what is necessary to start some businesses, in addition to the project they have on social networks, where they detail the entire journey since the accident. And in the end, there is no doubt that this experience has changed his life in an unimaginable way. And one of the main questions that exist on the network from the couple's followers is whether there is a lawsuit or not against the company for the obvious negligence. Loren is growing more independent daily, but occasionally still experiences the accident's lingering effects. For example, one of the damages she presented during her recovery was phantom pain in the limbs she is missing. He has woken up in the early morning completely convinced that his legs are bothering him, especially the left one. But as we know, that part of his body unfortunately no longer exists. Nowadays, they enjoy the fact of being together. They are questioned about thousands of topics, and maybe it's not the idyllic life they once imagined, but the only thing they are sure of is that they will never give up. Feeling very grateful as well because the fatal accident did not claim Loren's life. Remember that on this channel of Pepe Mystery, videos are uploaded on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, And on many more mysteries, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday are similar topics. But on this second channel, in many of the mysteries, I compile short videos